Sholem Aleichem. I'm Susan Bronson, the Yiddish Book Center's Executive Director and soon to be incoming President of the Center. It is my pleasure. Oh, thank you. It's really my pleasure to welcome all of you here today and everyone watching from home. We have hundreds of people watching virtually, so it's wonderful to have such a terrific audience for the annual Melinda Rosenblatt Lecture. Before I introduce Aaron, I want to thank Leif Rosenblatt, our board chair emeritus, who named this lecture in memory of his late wife, Melinda, and to thank Leif Rosenblatt and his family, his wife, Johanna Rosenblatt, and his son, Andre Rosenblatt, for their enduring commitment and friendship. Thank you, Leif. Certainly, Aaron Lansky needs no introduction. As all of you know, he founded the Yiddish Book Center 45 years ago and built this incredible institution which we all know and love. And not long ago, I was looking at board meeting minutes from the center's earliest years, when the center was more of an idea than a reality, and I think there are some of you here today who might have been part of those meetings. There was no money, there was no building, there was just hope and the belief that there was value in recovering Yiddish books. And despite all the obstacles, Aaron succeeded not only in recovering more than 1.5 million Yiddish books, but in rallying thousands of people like you behind the cause. And here we are today in this gorgeous building, the Adress for Yiddish, which stands as a symbol of the resilience of Yiddish culture and which serves as the home base for all of our bibliographic initiatives, educational programs, publishing projects, translation initiatives, oral history projects, exhibitions, and so much more that bring Yiddish culture to people around the world. It is truly a monumental achievement. Before Aaron comes to the stage, I hope you'll indulge me for a brief moment as I also convey my personal thanks to Aaron. I joined the center 15 years ago in the newly created position of executive director. And many people told me I was crazy to work for a founder. They said, you'll be frustrated. They said he'll never let go. Well, those naysayers did not know Aaron Lansky. They did not know that Aaron is an extraordinary listener and is always willing to hear different perspectives. They didn't know that Aaron would work with me as a true partner. They didn't know how lucky I would be to be part of this incredible institution. They did not know that Aaron would become more than a colleague. He and his wife, Gail, and their daughters, Chava and Sasha, have become treasured friends. And now, as I prepare to step into the role of president, I'll carry with me all I've learned from Aaron these last 15 years, and not only about the center and its work, but most importantly, about what it means to lead with humility, humor, authenticity, and in true partnership with those who work for the center and with all of you who support us. I'm comforted that he will remain involved as an advisor and someone I can call on for guidance, advice, and just an ear when I need it. So thank you, Aaron, for all you've accomplished to build the Yiddish Book Center, for bringing me along for the ride, and for trusting me to carry the center into the future. And before we begin the program, we have a special guest here today to recognize Aaron. I'd like to invite to the stage a dear friend and advocate for the center, our state representative, Mindy Dahm. Mindy?
Good afternoon, everyone. I have the privilege of representing the Yiddish Book Center in the Massachusetts House of Representatives and the honor of calling Aaron Lansky a friend. And Aaron, I'd like you to come out for a moment, please. I'd like to give you something. Come on. Aaron Lansky. So I have two citations for you. One is from the Massachusetts House of Representatives, of which I'm a member, signed by myself and the Speaker of the House. But I have another one from Governor Healy and Lieutenant Governor Driscoll. And I'd like to read that to you. But first, I just have a few words of my own, if I may. I know I'm stepping into your time here, so please indulge me. Is that all right with everybody? Just a little bit. Thank you. So, Aaron, you are the embodiment of the Pirkei Avot saying, you are not obliged to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. You have never desisted. I never used that word in a sentence before, but today's the day. Your immense work and your passion has taught us how, as a community, we can survive and thrive despite attacks and great adversity, and that the ways we express culture through language, holding on to it, sharing it, embracing it, music, literature, poetry, theater are our vehicles for resistance and replenishment. I couldn't thank you more. So now from the, thank you. So even though Massachusetts doesn't believe in kings and queens and we're celebrating our 250th anniversary, I don't know if you know this, we refer to our governor as Her Excellency. I'm not sure why, but I'd like to read Her Excellency's citation to you. I also don't know how she feels about that, actually. Okay, so this is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to Aaron Lansky. On behalf of the residents of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I am pleased to confer upon you this governor's citation in recognition of leading the Yiddish Book Center for 45 years. For nearly half a century, you have collected, saved, and made available thousands of Yiddish books, held Yiddish classes, and organized festivals involving Yiddish music and literature. We commend your lasting positive impact on Jewish history and Yiddish culture. The Commonwealth thanks you and wishes you continued success and happiness. Mazel tov. Ladies and gentlemen, Aaron Lansky.
Well, Shalom Aleichem. So as best I could figure it, I think I've delivered something like 1,500 separate lectures over the past 45 years. My wife can vouch for that because I was away from home so much of that time. So I spoke in the US and Canada, Mexico, England, Israel. Today, however, is the first time I've ever been asked to deliver the Melinda Rosenblatt Lecture, which is the most prestigious event we have here at the Yiddish Book Center. So I consider that in and of itself an accomplishment. My talk today is supposed to be a valedictory, meaning a kind of farewell address. It's a chance to highlight the center's accomplishments and adventures over the past 45 years, to reflect on what they mean, and at the risk of infringing on Susan Bronson's prerogatives here, I want to offer my own predictions about what lies ahead. The first time I spoke about the Yiddish Book Center, really the very first time I got up in front of an audience to talk about what we were doing, it was shortly after the Book Center began. And we had scheduled a big open house event at our warehouse in Florence, Massachusetts, not far from Smith College. Was anyone here there at the time? Rich, well done. And Abe, nice to see you both, yeah. Well, as you remember, it was a pretty funky space. And you had to climb up a set of rickety stairs. And loads of people showed up, way more than I expected. And I had actually prepared a speech that day, very well organized about what we were going to do and why it mattered and all that. And I stood up there just like I'm standing here in front of you now, considerably smaller audience, I might add. But I stood up there, and I don't know why, but suddenly I tossed away the whole speech, and it just occurred to me what I should really do is tell a story. So you want to hear the story I told that day? Because I still remember it kind of vividly. Okay. Hold on one second. So the story was that a few weeks before that event, I had gone down to New York City, to Co-op City in New York City. And I was down there to visit one of our Zomlers, a couple named Mr. and Mrs. Field. And the Fields lived in one of those high-rise buildings that you drive by or take the train by when you're going into New York. They were among our earliest Zomlers, or volunteer book collectors. And they were going to be going out and collecting books all over the Bronx and bringing them back to their apartment. And then every so often, I would come down to pick them up. So this was our first go-around at this. And they said, okay, the piles have gotten high enough, so it's time for you to come. And I showed up, and as I was to learn, it was become an occupational hazard. They had a whole meal waiting for me. And we ate that, and we drank the tea, hot tea out of glasses. And after all that was out of the way, they brought me into the next room, and there were maybe 20 or 30 bundles of books. And when I say bundles, I mean bundles. Maybe 6, 7 books to a bundle, very neatly tied in string, like the old-fashioned UPS logo. You know, it had that kind of a knot on it. And I said to them, I said, you know, I really appreciate that you went to all this trouble, I said, but we have boxes and we have hand trucks. You don't have to tie everything up and string quite so neatly. It's not necessary for you to do that. And Mr. Field said to me, he said, "Ihr versteht nicht," he said, "Wir haben nicht kein Maschine," which means we don't have an automobile. And he says, "Dafür wir fahren in Bus, kedei euch zusammen die alle Bücher." So we have to travel by city bus in order to collect all these books. And for years and years afterwards, they continued to do that. So I wanted to retell that story just because it was the first time that I truly understood how much Yiddish books meant to the people who were collecting them and the people who were giving them to us. They were really at the core of who those people were. There was nothing they owned that was more important than those Yiddish books. Sometimes they would say sometimes, "Junger Mann." Junger Mann is a Yiddish word that means young man. It became my generic name in the Yiddish world. They'd say, I don't hear that anymore, I just want to point out, yeah. And they would say, "Junger Mann, ot is mein Yerusha." This is my inheritance. This is what I'm leaving to the world, the most valuable thing I own. So in the 45 years since then, I've personally visited close to 3,000 separate apartments and houses. We were really on the road a lot. Sometimes we would do 10 visits in a day. But it still was a big undertaking. I would really love to spend my whole time today. Speaking of which, I should keep my eye on the clock too. Hold on. There we go. I would love to spend my whole time today just regaling you with stories of all the people I met along the way. But I'm not going to do that for two reasons. I'm going to resist that temptation. The first is because I already wrote a book about the subject called Outwitting History, available for sale up in the bookstore. Joke. And second, because after about 1,500 lectures, I figured that there's a good chance you've already heard a lot of the best stories. You haven't? Well, twice is always better than once. Okay. There was the time we raced through the night and took a train down to New York City to rescue 8,000 discarded Yiddish books from a garbage dumpster on 16th Street. You have to read the book to get the detail of that one. Or another time when we raced down to the city and enlisted local black and Puerto Rican kids in the neighborhood, and we organized them into a bucket brigade, all the way down into a basement of a building there, which had been home to an important Yiddish library, since abandoned. The new landlord didn't want to be storing books in space for which nobody was paying rent. And we organized these kids in the neighborhood into this bucket brigade, and they handed the books up outside and all the way into the truck and filled that truck up with Yiddish books that day. There were so many other stories like that. Usually when I give lectures, I focus on a few people in the audience. A lot of people who lecture tell me they do this. There were a few faces that just sort of resonate for you, and you just relate to them, and so you're always kind of checking in with them to see how they're responding. And so I did that the same. And one time I was addressing a large audience at a Jewish community center. When I got up to speak, I noticed that there was a woman in the front row who seemed way more into it than anybody else in the audience. So I'm looking at her the whole time, and I told a sad story, and she's crying. I told a funny story, and she's laughing. You could just read everything in her face. You could see it all. And so she just hung on to every word. A month later, I gave another speech at another Jewish community center about 40 miles away. And I walk in, and I was in the wings just like I was just now, and I can kind of look out and see the audience. And I look in the front row, and gewalt, it's the same woman is sitting there. So I said, oh no, I just want to go on record as saying, in all this time, with all the lectures I've given, I've never once given a lecture with the same notes twice. That never seemed quite right to do that. But don't be so surprised, because with computers, it's not that hard to regenerate the letter. But I realized that the woman had been there. She was the woman from the month before. And so before I went on stage, I'm there with a pen in the back, in the wings, and I'm furiously scratching out stories and putting other stories in its place. Fortunately, we've had enough stories over the years. I didn't run out of them. And so I spoke, and after the talk ended, I opened the floor to questions. And this woman in the front row, she's the first one to jump up, and I said, yes. And I thought she was going to take me to task because I had somehow repeated one story twice. And instead she said to me, she looks at me with a steely gaze, and she says, tell me, Why didn't you tell the story about such and such that you told last time? Yeah. With Jewish audiences, there's no winning, is the point I'm trying to make. So bear with me here. So I was a 23-year-old graduate student when I founded the Yiddish Book Center. And I can remember the exact moment. It's funny to think this, but I remember the exact moment. I don't remember what I had for lunch yesterday, but I remember the exact moment when I came up with the idea of trying to save Yiddish books. We were all sitting in class. When I say all, there were 4 students. The 4 students were sitting in class, and it was a particularly cold winter day. Somehow my recollection of Montreal was that it was always a particularly cold winter day. But I remember the sleet was sort of slanting across the window panes, and the radiators, there were steam radiators in this old building, and they're hissing the whole time. And the professor's up in front, and yet again we're having a discussion about where we could find copies of the book that he was assigning for the following week's class. And while all that was going on, I'm thinking, this is crazy. Someone should do something about this, that there are no books to be read in a great literature. And then I thought, wait a minute, I know how to drive a truck. Maybe I should do something about this. And so I went to my teacher, Ruth Weiss, who was one of the great Yiddish scholars of her generation, and I told her what I had in mind, and she thought it was a great idea. And I said, okay, I said, but how many books are out there, do you think? She had absolutely no idea, and nor did I. I said, but go to New York. She says, I'll arrange for you to meet with a bunch of Yiddish writers and scholars in the city, and you can ask them, and they'll have the answer for you. So I borrowed a suit, and I went to New York, and I met with these scholars, and we all sat around a big table, and as you might expect, it was rather cacophonous, and everybody talked at once, and after a lot of arguing, they finally arrived at a number. So the number is 70,000. Where they got 70,000 from, I have no clue whatsoever, but they all agreed, they had reached consensus, everyone was rather pleased with themselves. 70,000 Yiddish books were still extant and recoverable. And I thought, that sounds doable. I was close to finishing my master's thesis at that point. And so with Ruth's blessing, I took what I thought was going to be a 2-year leave of absence to go off and save the world's Yiddish books before it was too late. So I don't want to bury the lead in this whole story. What happened was within 6 months, we had saved 70,000 books. And we went on to save more and more and more. You can't see right now because the curtains are closed there, but if the curtains were opened, you'd see a big terrace out there. And underneath that big terrace is an underground book repository. And it's really big, and it's more Yiddish books than anyone's ever seen in one place before. And that's roughly about maybe 20% of our collection, maybe a little bit less than that. The rest of the books are stored in a secure, undisclosed location, not too far from here. But 1.5 million volumes. And in the process, the Yiddish Book Center, this kind of scrappy startup that all the Jewish leaders of the time utterly dismissed and derided, they called it delusional, quixotic, or just plain meshuggah. Somehow, this startup organization has grown into one of the largest, liveliest, and admittedly most unlikely Jewish cultural organizations in the world today. So for all of you who helped build it, you can give yourself a round of applause right now because not bad. But this valedictory is not going to be a reprise of my greatest hits because there are too many news stories I want to tell you and too little time in which to tell them. Like most businesses and most nonprofit organizations, we had to close our doors when the pandemic came. We actually had advance notice. Our board chair, former board chair, was in touch with a lot of medical people in Boston, and he knew maybe a month earlier what was coming, and he warned us about it. So we took precautions, and we made sure in case we couldn't get into the building again, that people would have laptop computers and everybody would be tied together, and that some of the telephones on key lines of the building would ring at different people's houses so we could stay in touch with our members. And, we had to close the door. I remember the day that I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning and I called Susan and she was already awake. And And we both agreed that was the day. You know, we couldn't stay open any longer. So I remember I came in, I think you were here, you came in as well, right? And I came in from like 5 minutes away. Susan drove in from the Berkshires. But we both came in, and we couldn't even like bring people together, the staff together, because we were just afraid at that point. No one knew how this was being transmitted. So we just told people individually at the door, and then they went home. And by the end of that day, I remember it was already dark out. It was March, I think March 13th. And it was a Friday, and it was a pretty sad Shabbos at our house that night. Our daughters had come home as well, and nobody knew what was happening next. And it was all very, very frightening in every way. And I was thinking about the book center and what was going to happen. I wasn't worried that we couldn't continue our educational programs. I knew we could do that online. I didn't know how to do it online, but I knew we had young people working for us who would know exactly how to do that. But I assumed that book collecting, going out and collecting old Yiddish books, I was pretty sure that was going to come to a screeching halt. Except the exact opposite was true. That Monday, we had a Zoom meeting of our whole staff. For almost all of us, and myself included, it was the first time we'd ever been on Zoom. So we spent half of the time, maybe 3/4 of the time saying, you got to unmute, But we did have a heads up, and we had arranged for classes to go on online, and the enrollments were astonishing. We kind of couldn't believe the kind of response we were getting. The very, very first program we offered during the pandemic was about a really obscure subject. It was, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it was 7 different versions of a single 5-line Yiddish poem, 7 different translations of a single 5-line Yiddish poem and how they differed. But it might have been 5 different versions of a 7-line poem. I'm not exactly sure. But this wasn't exactly something that would pack the house, if we had offered it in this hall. I don't think we would have gotten a minion for a program like that, 10 people. But after it was over, I called up one of our staff members who was running this, and I said, so how many people tuned in? And the number was 900 and something, 920 something, I think, had tuned in. And you know the expression in Yiddish, they say, "Azoi koch men lokshen." That's how you cook the lokshen. That's how you cook the noodles. That's exactly how I felt, because I said, wow, if a program like that could bring in 900 people that we could never dream of having come here, imagine what we could do with some really good programs, or more compelling programs. For all I know, the person who offered the program is here today, so I don't want to diss it. And I have nothing against the subject. It was interesting, but we were okay with the educational programs, but I was really sure we couldn't continue to collect books. How could we do that? You couldn't go out. You couldn't go anywhere. How could we possibly make that happen? And yet, it's interesting because the phones kept ringing, not here, but figuratively. The book donation programs actually rang for my assistant, Suzanne Rubenstein. Suzanne, where are you? Suzanne, thank you for everything. Here. Well, Suzanne was a hero during that period, because every time someone wanted to donate Yiddish books, they would call her. And Suzanne, I think you told me at the time you ordinarily got a few calls a week of people wanting to give books, and suddenly she was getting 5 to 10 calls a day of people wanting to give books. So why? What happened? What changed? What was that?
They had time to clean out their house.
Very, very good. That's exactly right, yes. They had time to clean out the house, so all those jobs to go clean the attic and clean the cellar they've been putting off for years, they suddenly were able to do that. And there was also, I think, a sense of foreboding that something horrible was coming. Don't forget, 1 million Americans died in that pandemic, just so we keep the record straight. And, I think they understood that Yiddish was a literature born of marginality, born of vulnerability. And I think for that reason, they felt that, maybe these books that my parents and my grandparents left to me, 80 years ago, maybe they have something to say in this situation as well. Whatever the reason was, the books kept coming and coming and coming. There were only 3 of us left in the building after we sent everyone home. David Mazower, our bibliographer. David, are you here? Thank you. We're not going to get an applause for everybody because it would go on too long, but it's implicit. And Ollie Schmidt, our building manager, and me. And we all had our quadrants well, those wouldn't be quadrants, wouldn't they? They'd be, I don't know what you call a division of 3. But we each had our section of the building, and David and I would talk to each other. I'd be at the balcony, and he was way down here, and we would have conversations. Because, again, we didn't know what was happening, and we didn't know how contagious this was or how it was spread. But almost every day, with the whole world closed down, almost every day, the FedEx truck and the UPS truck and the post office truck all backed up to the loading dock out there, and they offloaded books, and they would leave them on the dock, and then David would go out and get them. And then Dave would bring them into the building, and at first it was easy to stash them, but it got kind of crowded after a while because so many books were coming in. And pretty soon they were all over the place. We had to have a special mail appeal when the pandemic was over just to get extra help to go sort out all the books that had accumulated over the course of several years. Some people didn't want to just send us their books. They also wanted to come in person. They said, oh no, these books are much too valuable for me to trust them to entrust them to Federal Express. I have to come and give them to you. I was here one day, David, when it was a freezing cold day, and a man came in a very large Buick, as I remember, and he opened up the back door, and it was loaded with boxes of books. And it was quite cold outside, but he stood there. We had explained in advance that they couldn't even come into the building to use the bathroom. We had very tight rules in place. But he was perfect, had great equanimity about it all. And we sat outside for a very long time in very cold weather talking about the books that he was bringing us. Some of the books that we collected during that period were really extraordinary. You know, we've collected 1.5 million volumes. It's easy to say that. It's really hard to imagine what it looks like, though. It's just a vast number of books. And, but despite all of that, there were still a lot of books we had never seen before. There are still books we've never seen yet. And suddenly, a lot of those books began showing up as well, because kind of the low-hanging fruit came early. These were the books that people were treasuring in many cases, and only now were they willing to send them in. I remember once Dave and I were here, and we opened up a box that came from a shul, a synagogue outside, North Shore of Chicago, I think, right? And there were all sorts of extraordinary books in there, including 6 copies of a volume called Yiddish Dichterins, Jewish Yiddish women poets, that had been published in 1928. Still there, all right. 1928 had been published. It was a beautiful book. Elam Stein was the publisher, and it had tipped-in photographs, like real pictures, actually stuck on each section where different women's poems were found. This was a time when many women were writing in Yiddish, but they were almost never read or ever recognized or even published for the most part. So this book was really groundbreaking in every way. And, you know, we had only seen a few copies in, you know, whatever it was, 40 years prior to that. And suddenly here we had all of this, and it was very touching. You know, it's remarkable that all those books were coming in when you consider how long it had been since mass Jewish immigration to the United States was cut off. Does anyone know what year that was? Yeah, exactly. 1924 was when Congress put an end to unrestricted, you know, open immigration. And here we are, you know, more than a century later, and Yiddish books were coming in, and Yiddish books are still arriving. There have been all sorts of surprises, including lost works by some of the most important Yiddish writers. That's a phenomenon that would be unthinkable in almost any other language. You know, major writers who had written important works, and somehow they were just lost to history. But suddenly they began appearing as well, or at least we got traces of them. At one point, we held a conference. We do a lot of weekend programs and week-long programs here for students of all ages, including adults. So we had one of the adult programs, and it was called The Family Singer. The Family Singer meant Isaac Bashevis Singer, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, but also his older brother, I.J., or Yud Zinger, who wrote The Brothers Ashkenazi, among other just brilliant classic works, and also their lesser-known but no less talented sister, Esther Kreitman, who had ended up living in London. To our amazement, though, when the weekend began and people started showing up, who was there among the audience? The Family Singer. Bashevis had one son, one child, whom he abandoned, I think, when he was maybe 3 years old. He abandoned him in Poland. They eventually reunited many, many years later. But the one son, his mother brought him to Israel, where he became known as Israel Zamir. Zamir is singer in Hebrew, right? Israel Zamir. And he was a well-known correspondent for Haaretz, for one of the Jewish newspapers, or the Hebrew newspapers. And he came along with his remarkably exuberant extended family. So his kids were there and his grandkids were there. And wow, what a festive occasion. So Besheva Singer, in Yiddish he goes by the name Beshevas. The Singer part got tacked on for the American audience. But Beshevas had been the honorary chair of our board when the center first began. And he never came here, and I didn't really ever get to know him. It was hard to get to know him. He had a persona, a kind of folksy persona, but in real life he was cool, I would say. But he had been our honorary chairman, and so Israel was sort of the opposite person. His son was sort of the opposite personality. And he enjoyed every second of that weekend with all the presentations and all the analyses. And at the end of the week-long program, he said to me, look, I love what you're doing here. If there's anything I can ever do for you, just let me know. I said, well, as a matter of fact. And I let him know that almost all of Singer's work, very few of Singer's works, first of all, had ever been published in the original Yiddish. They were published in Yiddish in the Yiddish newspapers, serially, but not in book form. Only a handful had been published in book form. And I said, we would love to get permission, because most Yiddish books were never really copyrighted, but Singer's were. We said, we'd love to get permission so that we could issue the Yiddish versions of his works. And Yisrael said he would love it if we would do these. That was a great idea. He said, look, I'll go back to Israel, I'll talk to my lawyer, I'll work out the details, and I'll let you know. And not too long after that, he died an untimely death. And that was the end of it. You know, that's where it was. There was nowhere to go with it. Except that the conversation continued with some of his family and with Susan Schulman, who was the executor of the estate. And eventually, they agreed to follow Israel's wishes, and we did get permission to reprint them in Yiddish. And for anyone who read Yiddish, it was a revelation, because when Singer wrote those books, he would kind of translate by committee. He knew English, by the way, but not well enough to really write books in the language, or at least he didn't think so. So he would hire women, usually attractive women, and usually women who didn't know Yiddish. He thought that would be a disservice, because he would sit there and he would read the original Yiddish text, and then he would translate it as he went in a rough translation, and then they would write it down in nicer English. And then when he got to points that were a little sticky, or endings that were just way too tragic, he would say, you know, this ending, an American audience can't handle it. And on the spot, he would change the ending. And then it would go out there. Hold on one second. That wasn't all, though. The Singer estate eventually put us in touch with a young scholar named David Stromberg, he was a Soviet Jew who was living in Israel. Stromberg is just brilliant, and he was born in the USSR. He had researched Singer's nonfiction writing. It was his fiction writing that we all knew. But it turned out, under a different name, the name Warshawski, the person from Warsaw, he was publishing nonfiction work in the Forward and one other Yiddish newspaper. And this went on for many, many years. And David Stromberg thought that this would be really worthwhile to get that material out into the public as well. And so we worked with them. And where's Lisa Newman? Lisa? Lisa, you get a round of applause. I'm sorry, I can't resist, because these are not competitive rounds, but Lisa did so much with all of this, as she does with everything. Lisa had a background in publishing before she came to the Book Center, and she became the head of something called White Goat Press, which is the Book Center's own English language imprint, specializing in translations of Yiddish literature. And she negotiated, and we've been publishing a lot of this work now, and it's been really quite terrific. So we came out already. The third book's not out yet, is it? Thank you. Good thing you sat up front. Yeah. We've published two volumes of Singer's collected essays from two different eras. And we have a third volume that is coming out March? Okay, that's March, Mirz Hashem. Right, March, God willing, we'll have it out in March. That's of next year, we're not late, I just want to be clear. And when you read these essays, I don't know, I've always really respected Singer's fiction. You know, it's unusual, but I think it's really quite powerful. But it's only when you read the nonfiction work that you really appreciate why he got the Nobel Prize. He deserved it. And if you read the books, also available in the bookstore, yeah, they'll blow you away just by their sheer prescience. He wrote about fascism and what these were like being written in the 30s, these essays, and what was happening in Europe and what it all meant. And it's extraordinary how much he was able to foresee and how deep his analysis of Jewish life really went. I got to just check the time. Who's my timekeeper today? Suzanne? How much time we have left? And when are we finishing? Well then, all right. In that case, you're going to have to live in suspense, not knowing how there was a kind of Techias Mesim, a revival of the dead of another Yiddish writer named Chaim Grada, who was not only as towering a writer as Bashevis was, but Grada's wife hated Bashevis, and there was a lifelong kind of animosity between them. So much so she used to call his wife, used to call Bashevis Singer the blasphemous buffoon. She kind of came up with that. And I remember I came home from work one day. Mrs. Grada used to call me all the time, and she would go on and on and on. And one day she started calling the house. And if I wasn't there, she didn't even notice. She just kept right on with her diatribe against Bashevis. And one day I come home, and our daughter, Chava, was there. She must have been like 10 or 11 years old. And she said, "Daddy, what's a blasphemous buffoon?" And I said, uh-oh. So I had to call Mrs. Grada and ask her to please stop calling our kids. And then she started calling my assistant, Jane Kelly. And Jane Kelly got more of a mouthful from Mrs. Grada. She must have called her 100 times. Anyways, one of Grada's books was found recently, and one of the women, a woman who studied translation with us here at the Book Center, who was a Satmar Chosed and knew Yiddish very well and knew traditional sources, became the translator. And you probably read about this in the Times just a few weeks ago. The book is called called Sons and Daughters. And it just came out, and it's so fresh off the press that I haven't read it yet. I'm saving it for vacation. Actually, I'm retiring. I'm saying I have a long vacation to read it. So, you know, it's kind of amazing, because if you're studying English literature, you really got to work hard to find like the one paragraph of Henry James that someone hasn't written 3 dissertations about, you know? But if you're working with Yiddish literature, the most, you know, incredible, spectacular, you know, the very best writers in the literature have works that even now are coming to light for the first time. So there are a lot of surprises coming down the pike. You know, there is a painful question, though, that also lies at the heart of what we do. Older Jews used to come up, you know, right from the beginning, most American Jews were very happy with what we were doing to save Yiddish books. They thought that was a great thing. The mainstream press thought it was wonderful. But a lot of the older Yiddish-speaking Jews were rather upset with me. They would say, you know, why are you doing this? This is not a cause for celebration. You know, you're saving books only because nobody's reading them. That's the only reason that's happening. This is a terrible thing, not a celebratory occasion. And I sort of could understand their sorrow. You know, Jews called themselves Am HaSefer, the people of the book. But they really were people of books generally. There's an enormous respect for the written word. When I was growing up, if we dropped a book on the floor, it could have been a Tanakh, a volume of the Torah, but could also have been, I don't know, Norman Mailer or Erica Jong or anybody. And what did? We picked it up and we kissed it. Not because we were so in love with that particular book, but we kissed it because that was what Jews did as a sign of respect for the written word. Because books really defined us as a people. They were our history and our culture. So there was also a sadness to the fact that so many books were being thrown out or had been thrown out. Why did it happen? You don't have to look very far to find the answer. Look, in 1939, there were 11 million Yiddish-speaking Jews in the world. And by 1945, half of them had been murdered. So it's obvious, you know, where the challenges lay. Many writers and intellectuals fled eastward into the Soviet Union. Their increasing persecution culminated on a single night, August 12, 1952, when Stalin ordered the execution of most of his country's major Yiddish writers on a single night. So that wasn't so long ago. That was 3 years before I was born. You know, it's not ancient history that we're talking about here. And, you know, of course, in Israel, Israel, you know, was a wonderful rebirth after the war and after all that had happened. But it was also a break from the culture that had gone before it. There was something called the nation, an idea called negation of the galut, that the diaspora had been a terrible mistake. And I don't know if it was anybody's choice, but nonetheless, it had been a terrible mistake. And that we had to break with that and become a new, strong type of Jew. And therefore, Yiddish was rejected, and Hebrew was embraced as a spoken language. It was also a lingua franca, Hebrew, because it wasn't all East European Jews who came to Israel, of course. There were many Jews who came from Muslim countries and Levantine countries. 850,000 or so were forced out or urged out, you know, after the founding of the State of Israel. So, you know, Hebrew was a brilliant lingua franca. The problem was that we lost Yiddish almost entirely. There are still vestiges of it, but it's almost completely gone. And give me a second while I catch up with myself. And what happened in America? America was more complicated still, because America offered Jews freedom in a way we've never had it before. But the trouble was the Constitution guaranteed religious rights, right? Every person could believe in their own God in any way they wanted. But there were no protections for cultural and linguistic differences. So what happened was, as a people in America, Jews in America, we essentially redefined Jewish life in terms of religion alone, and the whole cultural side and everything that Yiddish represented, the voch, the everyday side of Jewish life, that was largely swept under the rug. It didn't disappear entirely. Jews would still get together up at the Catskill resorts and tell Yiddish jokes, and everybody would laugh. But I think Milton Berle did that on television too, if I'm not mistaken. But nonetheless, you know, for the most part, that specificity was lost in America. When I was a kid, I grew up in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And when I was a kid, I went to Hebrew school in the mansion of an old whaling captain. I tell you, Melville couldn't have invented this. They were in a mansion of an old whaling captain. And who were our teachers? They were all old men with heavy Yiddish accents. They weren't actually that old, but they had been through the war and they'd been through hell. And they had heavy Yiddish accents. And they were trying to teach us to, I don't know, to recite the Ashrei, you know, a common Hebrew prayer. And week after week after week, they're teaching us, and week after week after week, we couldn't learn anything. And they must have thought we were just total amharutzim, that we were just ignoramuses, and we thought that they were just relics of the past. And, you know, they would step at the front of the class, and they'd yell, and they'd say, sheket, you know, be quiet, be quiet. And we would retaliate with barrages of paper airplanes and spitballs. And so it was funny, but it wasn't exactly a way to, you know, to teach any kind of culture. So not only did we not learn Yiddish, we didn't learn Hebrew either. It was the upshot of the whole thing. But in America, you know, we were free here to to reclaim anything we wanted to. It's just that it took a long time. So I don't think the question is, how come suddenly there's a revival of Yiddish culture? I think the question is, what was going on in the 80 years in the interim, you know, when we had put all of this so far behind us? And I think we understand that. Hold on for a second. I'm skipping judiciously here, so just bear with me for 1 minute, okay? As I see it, the real measure of our success at the Book Center is not how many books we've saved. We have saved a lot of books. It's not the 1.5 million volumes in our vault and that we've sent out around the world. I think the real mark of our success is in how many of those books are now being read. And the answer is infinitely more than anyone ever thought possible. When I first started, I met with leaders of the Jewish establishment in New York, and I told them my idea to go out and save Yiddish literature, and they all said the same thing, you know. Even if you could pull this off, who in the world is ever going to read these books? They were sure that this was all dead and buried and finished. They were wrong to some degree. I mean, there were still large groups of Yiddish-speaking Jews. There were still schools, and there were still libraries, and there were still cultural organizations. But the truth is, it didn't seem very auspicious that these books would ever find new readers. They were modern books almost exclusively. Yiddish literature doesn't really begin till the 1860s. Most of them are 20th century books. They are novels, and their plays, and their poetry, and their memoirs, and their histories, and their social and political theory. Pretty much every field of human endeavor was explored in Yiddish. and the literature was powerful, and it's one of our great legacies as a people that we've inherited this literature, and yet that we didn't know about it for so long is a little bit of a shunda, to be perfectly honest. You know, there's shame in that we were so removed from all of it. On the other hand, the stars aligned when the Book Center began because technology served us exceedingly well. When I founded the Book Center, we used to brag that we were the only Yiddish organization in America. There were a lot of Yiddish organizations then. I think every political ideology had at least 5 organizations. So, but we were the only Yiddish organization in America with an electric typewriter. So, so we definitely weren't Luddites by any stretch of the imagination. But new technology came along very quickly. You know, we had collected so many books, but we still didn't have enough copies to go around to everybody who wanted them. We'd get a lot of duplicate copies. And then when we opened up this building, we were really off source, because people could come in here. Before that, they were stored in a warehouse in Holyoke. Suddenly, people could come into this building, and where the exhibits are now, that was all stack area at one point, and people would come in and they would see all these books that they really, really wanted. And they would ask if they could buy them. We would sell duplicate books. We'd have to say no. And then they were furious about us and would write letters to the editor of the Yiddish newspapers about how terrible we were. And we weren't quite sure what we were going to do exactly, except that one day a young member of our staff came to see me. And he said, you know, I think we've reached a point where it's possible to digitize these books. This is in like the mid-1990s. So forgive me, I'm really not a Luddite. My kids might feel otherwise. But I didn't know what the word digitize meant at that point. And I don't think most people did, really. And I said, okay. And then the young person gave me that look like our kids give me and explained that, you know, it means that you can basically take a computer image of every page of every book, and then you can put those into files online, put those into files on your own computers, and you can generate reprint editions on demand, and that sounded like a great idea for books of which we didn't have enough copies to go around. And we did that for a while, except the reprint editions were expensive, and it wasn't a perfect solution. And then maybe 10 years later or so, another young person came to see me, and he said, you know, I have good news. The internet's finally fast enough. We can literally put the books online. We didn't know how to do that, of course. We went to the Internet Archive in San Francisco. We worked with them, and they heard what we had done, and we had already scanned a lot of these Yiddish books. And the head of the archive, Brewster Kale, who's a computer genius, said to me, this is great, piece of cake. We can have every one of these books up online in 2 weeks. I said, okay, not sooner? You know, anyways, well, he was a little precipitous because he didn't understand that Yiddish went from right to left instead of left to right. So in the end, he had to get a senior programmer at Oracle who agreed to work pro bono on this project. It took him 2 years to do it. 2 years later, all the books went online. The Internet Archive is a progressive group. They're a nonprofit, and they believe in an open web, so they don't track exactly who's downloading what. They don't want that information out there. But they do track how many copies of each book are being downloaded. So that was useful. And then I saw in the newspaper one day that Brewster was giving a talk at Harvard. So I emailed him, or texted him, and no email back then, and I said, hey, any chance we could have dinner after your lecture? He said, yeah, of course. So we arranged to meet at some very nice restaurant in Harvard Yard, and it was in the wintertime, it was near Christmas, and there were these beautiful white lights everywhere and reflecting in the snow. And we sat there, and we had a very good meal and a lot of wine, and finally when it was over, I leaned back and I said, okay, so how many downloads have we had? How many times have these Yiddish books been downloaded from your site? And he says, I don't know, I have to check. And he has a knapsack with him, and he takes out the biggest MacBook computer I'd ever seen, and he sits down, and he starts typing like in a fury. For 20 minutes, I would say, maybe it was a little less, but for 20 minutes more or less, he's just gone. He's just typing. And finally, he slams down on the enter key, and he says, I have the number. I said, what's the number? The number is, I don't remember it exactly, but it was something like 520-something thousand books have been downloaded. Or books have been downloaded 520-something thousand times. Well, that completely blew me away. If it had been 5% of that, I would have been blown away also. But the number was more than any of us ever thought possible. We didn't know there were that many Yiddish readers in the world. We had no idea there was that much interest in this literature. And it really changed the way we thought about everything. And then in case all that wasn't good enough, there was one more event, Min HaShamayim, one more kind of gift from heaven that came to us. One day we received an email from a man in the French Pyrenees named Asaf Yuri Eli. Asaf is a genius. He was born in South Africa, grew up in Israel, studied computer science in the United States, and he was now working on a range of projects. And one of those was to develop Yiddish OCR, optical character recognition, which would allow us to make everything searchable. So that was a really big deal. We had once looked into doing this commercially, and the price we got was $10 million. And here's Asaf, and he said he had done the whole thing single-handedly. And he had, and he sent it to us, and he agreed to share it with us for free. And then Gail and I invited him to our house for Shabbos dinner with his wife, who was half Jewish and half Armenian. My mother said she didn't have enough tzoros as it was. Anyway, so, and they're two tow-haired Russian kids. And we sat talking over dinner, and Asaf was so interested. He knows about absolutely everything. And I said to him, so what do you do for a day job? You're not making any money, it's, working on Yiddish OCR. What do you actually do? And he's very modest, and he said, well, actually, I have my own software company, and we're the chief programmers for the French Space Agency. And I said, you're a rocket scientist? And but he was a rocket scientist, and he was brilliant. And he's been working on this project ever since. He's made enormous strides. It's now very easy to find anything in Yiddish thanks to this OCR technology that he's developed. He now continues to work on the project, but only twice a week when he commutes from his home in the Pyrenees, I think, to Marseille. And he said he takes the TGV, the high-speed French train down there. And he says while he's on the train, as long as he's on the train, he works on Yiddish OCR. And I said, it's a shame you don't live in the United States, because if you commuted by Amtrak, you'd have this done long ago, Well, clearly that technology also presages a great revolution. Now, I got to check with my timekeepers here. Who's the official timekeeper? And is 3, how hard an end date is that? Let's get a sense of the crowd. You want me to keep going? All right. There are just a few stories that kind of have to be told, so just bear with me, and I'll try to do it reasonably quickly. Well, in the end, we didn't just collect books. We've collected all kinds of treasures. And among those were oral histories. At one point, we started a fellowship program here at the center. And one of our very first fellows was a young woman named Krista Whitney. Krista was a student, actually a dance student at Smith College. And she's not Jewish. There's nothing Jewish about her. She doesn't want to be Jewish, but she became fascinated by Yiddish and Yiddish literature. She studied with Justin Cammey. Then she came here and did our summer program at the Book Center. Eventually, she went off to Vilna, and studied there. And then we started the fellowship program. She joined us. And she said to us, she says, it's not enough just to collect Jews' books. I think we need to collect their personal stories as well. And at her urging, we ended up launching an oral history project. And it was remarkable because so many people were ready to tell their stories. In the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, and he stoppeth one of three, and he has this story, grabs hold of people and just has to tell this very, very long story in verse. Well, it was sort of the same thing. The people we met, they all had extraordinary stories to tell. Jews so lived in the thick and swirl of history. And they had stories that they were just eager to tell any young person that would listen. So when we used to go out collecting books, sometimes we would have a tape recorder that if they were really nervous and I thought it was going to be a really good story, but they didn't want us to record it, I would sometimes forgive me, but I would leave the recorder running in my pocket just because it was too good to lose. I felt like Max Brod with Kafka's Papers, It was sort of an ethical dilemma, but I erred on the side of history. Only the real history can ever judge what the right thing was. but I just knew how much people like to tell stories. We had another episode once. We produced a series of Jewish short stories from Eastern Europe and beyond in English, read aloud by Hollywood and Broadway actors that ran as 13 one-hour radio shows on National Public Radio. And it was such a success, it went into 4 years' worth of reruns. Somebody told me that's just because NPR always is looking for Jewish content at renewal time, at pledge time, because they know who their supporters are. Nonetheless, four years of reruns with this. And when we produced that series, most of the actors, every famous actor we asked agreed to read for us. Everybody. Like, we had like real movie stars like Lauren Bacall and then others who were kind of more modern movie stars, but who were still thrilled to do this. At one point, Walter Matthau was reading a story for us. Walter Matthau actually started his career in the Yiddish theater. He was a kid, he was very tall, and he was working selling ice cream bars at one of the Yiddish theaters on 2nd Avenue. And he said he'd go up and down the rows and yell in Yiddish, "Get your ice cream here," And one day, one of the actors on stage got sick, and they needed someone to stand in. They said, "What about that tall kid? His Yiddish is okay." And they put a fake beard on him, and they stuck him on stage. And he loved it, and he became an actor, Not a Yiddish actor exactly, but he became an actor, and he just loved it. So when it was his time to read the story, Gail and I were up in Nova Scotia, and Lori McGlinchey, our producer, was out in Los Angeles, and she was with Matthau in the studio. And like halfway through the day, she called me up. She said, "I don't know what to do. We got a real problem on our hands." I said, "What's the problem?" She says, "Well, listen," she says, "I got to patch you through to the control room so you can actually hear what's going on." And she patches me into the control room, and there's Matthau, and he's reading one of the Tevye stories by Shalom Aleichem. And he reads 2 sentences, he's a great reader, reads 2 sentences, he says, "That reminds me of a story." Yeah. I said, "We have to go out at some point. Susan, put this on your list, that somewhere down in the cellar, those tapes, the original tapes are there somewhere. They'd be a bestseller on the premium market." So, well, we knew the Jews liked telling stories, and Krista knew that it was time to get them to do that. So a couple out in Palo Alto, Deb and Peter Wexler, put up the money, and we launched a program to start recording oral histories. It's very difficult to do. Krista was insistent on following the rules of oral history scholarship and of doing everything exactly properly. I wanted to do it only in audio. I thought it'd be cheaper, and I said I thought people would feel more relaxed if it was just a tape recorder. And Krista said, "Nope, it has to be video, because otherwise we can't get onto YouTube." At which point I had to say, "What's YouTube?" Yeah. And she explained, and she was right. Krista, above all else, is a superb listener. She and I were both trained at the same time to do oral history interviews. I was an utter failure. I did one interview, and that was the end of my career, because I thought it was supposed to be conversational. "So what did you do that time in 1926 in Vilna?" And someone would say, "Oh, that's what happened to me once." And when I was, anyways, and this is going back and forth. It was entertaining, but it wasn't the way you're supposed to do it. Krista, on the other hand, said, when you get the people in the studio, the first half hour is always a complete waste of time, because they come in and they tell you all the stories they rehearsed at home. But then once they get that out of their system, she would then ask one very astute question, and suddenly the people burst into tears, and their whole life story comes pouring out of them in an utterly candid way. So that project also was a huge hit. And since I have really limited time, you know what they call this when you're rushing like this and you can't fit it all in? They say that's speaking a regel achas, a regel achat. What does that mean? On one foot, because it's a story about Hillel years ago and Shammai, and they had a great disputation about aspects of Jewish law. And one of Shammai's students came to Hillel's house, and he said, "If you're such a great scholar, I want you to explain the entire Torah to me, al regel achas, while standing on one foot." And Hillel did it. What did he say? Actually, that's what Jesus said. Yeah. No, but you're very close, Rich. What he said is, don't do unto others what you don't want. You're getting a lot less mischief that way. If you do what you think what they want you to do, that never ends quite well. But so we have that expression in Yiddish, so I'm going to skip even more shamelessly. And I will only, I think I got to teach a course maybe next year and get the rest of this out here. Hold on. No, we're going to skip this. We're going to skip this. Good stories, though, so come back next time. And, well, I think I'll just tell you one last story that was in my book, and actually was the subject of it was the head of a chapter in the book that I wrote. And we were once organizing Zomlers in New York City. And we had called people into the workman's circle, I think. We sat them all down in a big hall, and I was explaining what it meant to be a Zomler, a volunteer book collector, and what the responsibilities were, and how it worked, and how they could do it. And I told the whole story, and there was one elderly man there. I keep saying elderly man. He's probably younger than I am now. But anyway, so there was one person of indeterminate age there, and he kept kind of like huffing and puffing. It was clearly that he wasn't enjoying any of this. And he goes, those kind of gestures. And finally, after the whole event, I had to wheel the materials outside into the truck, and he follows me into the elevator. And once the door closes, he says, "All right, younger man, do you know what the trouble is?" And I said, "I have no idea. What's the trouble?" He said, "The trouble is people are dying today who never died before." And it was a little hard to argue with that. However, the truth is, I think every generation must say that in one form or another. The truth is, everything's always changing. It's the nature of life. It's the nature of all life on this planet. And it's not like this is a bad thing. Everything has to change in some ways. So when I got the idea of retiring at first, this was like maybe 10 years ago when it first entered my mind. Before that, I thought I would just keep working forever. And I started asking friends of mine who had retired, and I'd say, "How did you know it was time to retire?" And they'd say, "Don't worry, you'll know." I didn't know what they were talking about. But eventually I learned what they were talking about. They, in the Inuktitut language, which is the language spoken in the Arctic, they say there are 53 different words for snow. Jews, on the other hand, have hundreds of words just for exhaustion. So you can be mead, you can be oiskematit, you can be famatit. There are plenty and plenty of words to say that you're tired and tuckered out. And I think I experienced every one of those words over the last 45 years. So here I am now, and I figured that it was time. I can't carry 100-pound boxes anymore. I ended up ripping my shoulder up so badly I had to have surgery a few years ago during the pandemic. My memory's not as keen as it once was. My mind's not as nimble as it once was. It seemed like I'm not done yet, by the way. I still got plenty of energy left. But it did seem like the right time to pass the helm to someone else, to the next generation. Susan's only 7 years younger than I am. So Susan, I hate to break the news, but even at 8 years younger, it doesn't quite qualify as a generation, but close enough. But it was really time to pass leadership on to the next group that would come along and to others. Because the truth is, we've created a wonderful and brilliant and beautiful organization here, but we need people with new energy and new ideas to come in and help to run it as well. And so we had an international search that went on for like 7 years, I think. And in the end, we found Susan 15 feet away from my office. And we realized that she really was the perfect person for that job. And if you don't know her yet, you will get to know her. All I can tell you is that she is strong and smart and clear-eyed and well-liked by the staff and the board and the donors and pretty much everyone else. She was the one who hatched the idea of Yidstock, our very popular music festival. She's the one who's forged wonderful partnerships with public libraries around the country that we absolutely love. And she's the one who will lead the Book Center into its next 45 years? Yeah. Yeah, there you go. Okay. Work on that arithmetic, though, yeah. So is the center going to change under new leadership? Yeah, I hope so. It really needs to, because it's living and it's alive, and I'd be really disappointed if it didn't change. But I guarantee you it'll change in wonderful ways. and there'll be new ideas and new visions. And I am confident that Susan will re-energize the Book Center, not that it doesn't have enough energy as it is, but that she will add to the energy of the Book Center, forge new partnerships outside this organization, reach out to new constituencies, and bring Yiddish where it's never gone before. If you're worrying about Hemshech, about continuity, sorg sich nicht. It's all going to be fine. Not only will Susan be here, but we have 42 amazing people on our staff, and every one of them is creative and energetic, and to borrow from Mary Poppins, practically perfect in every way. And so I have no worry whatsoever. As Susan mentioned, I'm not leaving completely. I'm going to stay on as a senior advisor. I like to downplay that senior word, I think. But anyways, as an advisor for the next 2 years and help Susan in any way that I possibly can. But I am retiring, and there are new frontiers, and I'm very eager to try my hand at after 45 years. I'm not going to change fields exactly. That's a little bit too much to ask. But I'm hoping to teach again, and I'm hoping to write, and we're going on a trip. And, you know, things will be different and interesting, and I'm very pleased about that. There's no question that we're living in a very parlous time right now. It's scary, and it's disorienting, and I think we're all concerned about what the future brings. But despite all of that, as Susan mentioned in her introduction, I remain passionately optimistic about the Yiddish Book Center and about Yiddish and about the future of Jews and Jewish culture. You might say there's no reason for that optimism whatsoever. That may be true, but it hasn't stopped me this far. And I just want to say that with the Yiddish Book Center wouldn't be here today. With our 1.5 million books and our tens of thousands of members and supporters and 2 iconic buildings and a balanced budget and a growing endowment, we wouldn't be here today if the organization itself were not optimistic. I don't think a Yiddish organization can be anything but optimistic. And some people used to marvel at that, but it's the truth. I'll end by saying that there are 2 inscriptions in the hallway when you walk into this building. Anybody notice them on the way in today? I'll tell you what they say. One's in Yiddish and one's in English. First, yes, that's the English one, and I'll give you the Yiddish one as well, and then I'll explain the second one. The first one is by a poet named Kadia Molodowski, one of the great Yiddish poets. And she wrote in one of her poems, Wer wird übermischen die gelbe Blätter? Who will turn and leaf through these yellowed pages? I think we now have the answer to that. When I started the center, I was often dismissed by Jewish funders who said, who in the world is going to read these books? Now we know there are plenty of people who are going to read them. And they might not be gelbe Blätter, yellowed pages anymore, but there's certainly pages on a screen, and there's certainly more readers than we ever would have imagined possible in our wildest dreams. So the answer is us. It's who's going to leaf through those pages. And the second quote, as Penina said, is from Max Weinreich, the founder of the YIVO, the author of a monumental 4-volume history of the Yiddish language, the teacher of my teacher, Ruth Weiss, and arguably one of the greatest Jewish cultural and linguistic historians of the last century. Weinreich's observation comes not from, his observation is Yiddish has magic, it will outwit history. That came not from a poem, and not from a tome, and not from a monument. Rather, it's something he just said in passing one day. He had been in Denmark when the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939. He escaped. He made his way eventually to the United States. He reconstituted the YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, here. And he had a huge influence. But he had limited numbers of students in America, nothing like what he had had in Europe. And I once met one of his students, and she was the one who told me this story. She said that she went up to Weinreich once, and she said, Professor Weinreich, you are one of the great Yiddish scholars of Europe. And here you are now in New York, and you have just a few of us students. How can you possibly go on like this? And that's when Weinreich just looked at her and he said, it's because Yiddish has magic, it will outwit history. It was very matter of fact. And I don't think he expected that was going to be on the entrance to a Yiddish Book Center someday. But after all that's happened, I think that just resonates more loudly than ever. It gave me the title for my book, and I've considered it a mantra for anyone who works in the Yiddish world. After 45 astounding years, the time's finally come for me to step down. But I do so in the sure knowledge that Yiddish in the Yiddish Book Center will endure. So, final Yasher Koyach here. And so, to my family, Gail, my wife sitting in the front row here, and to our amazing children out there in the ether on the internet, Sasha, Chava, and our new son-in-law, Scott. To the donors who built this organization, to my colleagues who run it, to my successor who will take the helm, to each and every one of you, I say Yasher Koyach, thank you and congratulations. It's never been easy, but it was the greatest privilege of my life to lead the Yiddish Book Center for these past 45 years. Looking back, I don't know exactly how we did it, but I do know that thanks to you, our optimism has proven well-founded, and improbably, inexorably, and triumphantly, Yiddish has outwitted history yet again. Thank you all very much.